Welcome everyone. What we have here is a 45 caliber side hammer percussion lock Connecticut Valley Arms muzzle-loading rifle. Those of us who still use firearms like this believe that to this day this is still one of the most exciting guns you can shoot. Rifles like this have largely been replaced by modern inline muzzle-loading rifles. I believe this has been done for a number of reasons. Foremost among them are probably convenience of use and reliability of use. So we're nearing a stage where the use of a gun like this, as it was done in decades past, is in danger of becoming a dying art. We are going to take a detailed look at what it takes to make one of these things perform as an effective and reliable hunting weapon. And of course, we'll cover the fundamentals thoroughly for the benefit of any novices who may be watching. I am the original owner of this gun, and the appeal to me, then and now, was using a firearm that is very steeped in history. Guns almost identical to this have been around for 170 years. By comparison, modern guns that use smokeless gunpowder and have barrels and receivers of proof steel have been around for about 120 odd years. The smokeless gunpowder generates very high pressures. It continues to burn and accumulate pressure as the bullet travels down the barrel until such time as it exits the muzzle. It takes very good steel to handle all that pressure, and using the proper metal for those kinds of gun is very, very critical to safety. Needless to say, these are things that didn't exist around 1840 when the percussion lock muzzle-loading rifle was developed. They used the best steel that they had, but they were able to use these guns safely because they used what is called these days black powder. And that is powder that is made with sulfur, charcoal, and potassium nitrate. Compared to modern smokeless powder, black powder generates much less pressure in the barrel. Therefore, it is much safer with this kind of gun. And needless to say, it's very important that no one ever attempt to use smokeless powder in a gun like this because the pressures will be too high. These guns are not constructed to handle that kind of pressure. Black powder is great stuff in my opinion because it blows a huge amount of smoke out the muzzle when it goes off, and it also blows a lot of fire out of the muzzle. The way I typically load and shoot this gun, it will send a flame roughly 10 inches out of the muzzle. Yet for modern shooters, accustomed as we are to many conveniences of the 20th and 21st century, black powder has a downside also. Compared to a modern smokeless powder firearm, a gun using black powder will accumulate an enormous amount of fouling in the barrel. The effects of this fouling when shooting can be minimized if we load the gun the correct way. Many times I've taken this gun and shot it 2 dozen times, 3 dozen times, 4 dozen times, yet at the end of my shooting I was able to load the gun as easily as when I started, and fouling presented no problems to loading and shooting. On the other hand, if we do not use the proper technique for loading this gun, what can happen is the gun will foul so badly in 3 shots that you won't be able to load the 4th shot, and the bullet will get stuck somewhere in the bore before you can drive it all the way down to the breech with the ramrod. Now let me add very, very quickly that one should never ever attempt to shoot a muzzle-loading rifle when the bullet is stuck in the middle of the barrel. The bullet must be all the way down the barrel, fully seated firmly against the breech and the powder. If you attempt to shoot a muzzle-loading rifle with the bullet stuck somewhere in the middle of the bore, what can happen is the barrel will explode like a pipe bomb. It would be a very, very dangerous situation. Never attempt that. There are 2 ways to remove this kind of a bullet from the bore, one of which is to use a ball worm and to draw the charge. You can do that if the bullet's not stuck too badly, but if it is stuck very badly, what you're going to have to do is get it out when you actually clean the gun, and I'll describe both of these procedures later on. Also, cleaning one of these guns is very much different than cleaning a modern gun. The way I have always cleaned this firearm is in the time-honored method of using hot water and soap. It is true that these days different manufacturers produce a substitute black powder. That is to say, a gunpowder that burns at pressures similar to that of black powder, and therefore are safe in muzzle-loading rifles, and additionally do not create so much fouling and possibly make cleaning the gun an easier job. I've never used anything but black powder in this gun, so we're going to discuss the techniques appropriate to that. And certainly if one learns those, I'm sure that they will serve him or her well when using a black powder substitute. Next, some details about black powder. Here we're looking at two cans. One is marked F, one is marked F. These F designations tell us how coarse the grains of powder are. 3F is finer than F. They also make a 4F, which is even finer, and they at one time at least they were making a 5F that was even finer than that. And on the other hand is a single F, which is more coarse. I've used both F and F in this gun. It's typical when people shoot flintlock rifles that they use a powder in the pan that's a finer grade than the powder in the barrel. The cans that I showed you are pretty old, and the powder is pretty old. Black powder, if stored correctly, will pretty much last indefinitely. The Union Army, at the end of the Civil War, captured an enormous amount of black powder from the Confederacy, and they continued to use that powder in the following decades. I've heard old wives' tales that old black powder will foul more, or it'll do this or do that. I don't believe any of that. As long as it's kept dry and it will ignite, in my experience, it's as perfectly good as black powder that was recently produced. The next section is ammunition. What I tend to shoot in this gun is a round lead ball in .440 caliber. Now the barrel is .45 caliber, yet the lead ball is .44 caliber. How do you do that? Well, the situation is you wrap the lead ball in a patch that has been permeated, soaked with grease before you load it down the barrel. Now in this way, the patch will grab the rifling. It will allow the gun to load with moderate ease, and when the gun fires, the patch will put a spin on the bullet. The bullet will continue on its way spinning to give you an accurate shot. The round ball for this gun I have described weighs 120 grains. It also is possible to use longer bullets that are much heavier, weighing 200 or more grains. Here are two examples. The one on the left is wider near the nose than it is at its base. This will allow the rifling to grab that white part near the tip, and that will put the spin on the bullet. The ones on the right are a version of the famous Civil War mini ball. They are slightly smaller than the bore, but they have a hollow concave section at their base. When the gun is fired, that section will expand and grab the rifling. There are, of course, more modern bullets that people are making these days with different sorts of plastic. It's somewhere on the bullet. And they will, if they're .45 caliber, work in this gun. I would refer you to the manufacturer's information on precisely how to use those bullets, because there's something I've never used in this thing. By comparison, the longer bullets I did show you need to be lubricated. And what I would lubricate them with is the same material with which I will lubricate the patches. In my experience, if I use the correct lubricant, it will allow me to shoot many shots in succession without having any kind of problem with fouling in the bore. If, on the other hand, I use an incorrect lubricant, I experience all kinds of problems. The lubricant that has worked best for me is nothing more than Crisco, the stuff you buy in the supermarket, vegetable shortening you use to bake and cook with. Nothing I have tried on patches or bullets works better than Crisco. If, on the other hand, I use a petroleum-based lubricant on the patches, something like some kind of an oil, what will happen is I will accumulate a lot of fouling very quickly in the barrel, and very, very soon it will be very, very hard to load the gun. This makes sense, I think, if we pause and consider the hundreds of years with which these guns have been used. They had nothing available to them but animal and plant products, like different kinds of animal greases. It would make sense that this system is compatible with that kind of approach. Also, we have to be careful when we buy store-bought manufactured products. I purchased a bunch of lubricated patches for use in a muzzle-loading rifle. I don't know how old these patches were, but they were terrible. I probably would have been better off if I had used motor oil as a lubricant, because what happened was they fouled the barrel so badly I could not load the fourth shot. It is, of course, impossible for me to know exactly when those pre-lube patches I purchased were made, It could be that they might have worked well when they were new. Yet I think the lesson from this is the most reliable thing to do is to grease your patches yourself. It's awfully handy to purchase dry patches to use in a .45 caliber muzzle loading rifle such as this, but in lieu of that, it's certainly no trick to make your own out of some sort of material. The main requirement is it has to be thin enough to go down the barrel, yet it has to be thick enough to grab the rifling, and once those two things are accomplished, I don't think it matters what kind of fabric is used. Certainly something like a moderately heavy cotton ought to do the trick with no problem. My favorite cleaning patches are flannel. I go to a fabric store, buy a yard of the stuff, and cut it up into patches. When it comes to lubricating bullets, what I tend to do is just rub some Crisco on the bullets, set them aside, let the lubricant solidify a bit. When it comes to patches, I would heat some of the stuff in a pan, the Crisco that is, let it get liquid. I put the patches in, fish them out with a fork, let them cool off on a piece of paper. Next, loading and shooting. It's important to note I'm confining my remarks to this particular gun, of which I am the original owner. If you don't know the history of a muzzleloader that you come across and you have any doubts about it, it's best to get it checked out by a gunsmith before attempting to fire it. One never knows. Next, how much gunpowder to use. When I got this gun, it came with literature recommending no more than 75 grains of black powder be used. I figured if it could handle 75 grains, it could handle 80 grains, and I have consistently used nothing but an 80 grain charge in this gun. Using a muzzleloader requires certain accessories, which in fact may be part of the charm, and one of those accessories is this little guy right here. This is a powder measure. As I recall, it could be used for anything from 50 to 120 grains, and I have it set on 80. But before I load the gun, I grab another accessory, this little guy. It's a cleaning jag. What I do is I run a couple of dry patches down the bore. Now the reason I do this is when I cleaned the gun previously, I left lubricant in the bore, and it's important to do that with a muzzleloader of this type because when using black powder, if you leave the bore dry after you clean it, it will still corrode. Rust, in other words. So I put lubricant down in it, yet before I fire it, I want to remove that lubricant, and I run a couple of dry patches down the bore to clear the lubricant out. And as many of you probably know, a jag of this type will allow a patch to firmly grip the rifling as it goes up and down the barrel. In the unlikely event you lose a patch down in the barrel, you can use one of these, a patch worm, fasten it on the end of a cleaning rod, stick it all the way down, twist it. You'll snag the patch and you can pull the thing right out. Also, before loading, it is a good idea to clean under the nipple. The nipple is right here. This is the part of the gun upon which the percussion cap is placed. The nipple can be removed with a nipple wrench, this guy, and one can use a Q-tip and alcohol to clean beneath the nipple in the area called the nipple bolster to make sure it's perfectly dry in there also. There is another method. In lieu of this, one can simply go out into the field and put a couple of percussion caps on the nipple in succession, pull the hammer all the way back, pull the trigger, bust those caps. That will tend to dry out the area beneath the nipple. It's also worth noting that percussion caps come in different sizes. This particular gun uses caps size number 11. Yet another accessory is this guy. This is a loading block. It's a piece of hardwood. In the holes are balls that are surrounded by grease patches. One can simply position one of these over the barrel and using a bullet starter, this guy, shove the bullet a couple of inches down to the bore and then switch to the ramrod. So once we know the barrel and the nipple bolster are dry, the procedure is quite simple. Measure some gunpowder into the measure. I pour it out of a powder horn. Dump it down the barrel. Get a patched bullet started. Switch to the ramrod. Shove the thing all the way down to the bottom. It is perfectly acceptable and often necessary to seat the bullet all the way down to the breech with the ramrod by a series of whacks. Usually the bullet will slide down with one long easy push once you get past about mid-barrel. What I do next is a trick that was taught to me a long time ago by an older guy, and I have never seen the method he described to me written about in print anywhere. The story is, after I started shooting this thing, I sought him out because I was having problems with accuracy. So this fellow, he listened to my story and nodded his head and spit out a little chewing tobacco juice, and he says, well, what you need to do is throw the ramrod down the barrel. As you can imagine, I really didn't know what the heck he was talking about, but he went on to explain that when I seat the charge all the way down on top of the powder, down near the breech with the ramrod, what I then do is pull the ramrod up about halfway out of the barrel, and then with a throwing motion force it down onto the bullet. What will happen when the bullet is not perfectly seated is the ramrod, thrown this way, will hit the bullet and come to a stop. It came to a dead stop because the bullet moved a little bit in the barrel. If the procedure is repeated 2 or 3 times, what will happen is finally the ramrod will hit the bullet and bounce 2 or 3 times. You throw it down, whack, click, click, it bounces. As my older mentor explained it to me, once you accomplish this, the bullet is firmly seated upon the charge with no airspace beneath, nothing but gunpowder. And it did make the gun perfectly accurate. He also explained this throwing technique was more helpful with patched round balls, and with elongated bullets it certainly was less necessary. With an elongated, heavier bullet, it's much easier to get it fully seated simply by pressing on the ramrod. Once the gun is loaded, it's now time to put a percussion cap on the nipple. There's another accessory, a cap loader, and there are many different types of cap loaders. The hammer on this gun is very much like hammers that have been used for centuries. It has 3 positions. First position is all the way down. Second position back is half cock, at which point the gun cannot be fired because the trigger won't drop the hammer when you pull it on half cock. And then after that there's full cock all the way back. When you pull the trigger on full cock, down the hammer goes. It's probably worth mentioning at this point the percussion caps, like the powder, have to be kept dry. There's that age-old piece of advice, keep your powder dry. That was very important to people in bygone centuries, and they took the adage to heart. It's best to store the powder and caps in a nice dry place. It's also worth pointing out that I've hunted with my gun in drizzly conditions and had it work just fine. Of course, if it's raining heavily, that's a completely different story. You're just out of business. When this gun was new, I obtained literature that told me that if I put 80 grains of black powder down the bore and I put a 120 grain round ball in a grease patch and I load the gun that way, that the gun will shoot that bullet out of the muzzle at somewhere in the vicinity of 1900 feet a second. This thing will absolutely clobber the daylights out of anything that it hits. My most spectacular day with this gun came when I shot a deer 75 yards away that was running as fast as it could go and running away from me at an angle. I was swinging the gun and following the deer before I lowered my eye down to the sights, and when I did, by some miracle, the sights were perfectly lined up right in front of the deer's chest as the deer was traveling. I pulled the trigger, and the bullet hit the deer on one side, behind its paunch, pretty much in the stomach area, and that bullet exited in front of the shoulder blade on the opposite side. It traveled more than 2 feet through that deer and went flying out the other side. Okay, it was a lucky shot, I guess. That's fine. I'll take luck any day. My purpose in telling this story is to let you know what this gun is capable of doing. Whenever I read about or hear about someone discussing firearm ergonomics, I always think of this thing, because it hardly has any ergonomics at all. Yet back when this gun was new and I hardly knew any better, I really never had any problem using it. I adjusted to it. I was always able to get up and get on target. I found it to be very effective. One thing that's not a bad plan when someone is getting used to one of these guns and learning how to shoot them is to have some black powder solvent or cleaner on hand, along with some clean patches and a cleaning jag. If the barrel seems like it's fouling too much, what one can do is wet a patch with the solvent or cleaner, run it down the barrel, follow it up with a dry patch, and that will greatly facilitate shooting if in fact fouling becomes an issue. So let's suppose you go deer hunting with a gun like this and you don't see anything and you're going to go hunting the next day. What do? What I tend to do is remove the percussion cap, which now means the gun is unloaded, and go home. If the conditions were damp, what I would do would be remove the nipple, shake what powder is under the nipple out, replace it with new powder applied through the hole under the nipple, put the nipple back in. It can happen that powder might get damp under the nipple and not fire, yet if we replaced it, the gun would indeed fire. On the other hand, let's suppose it's your last day of hunting and you did not fire the gun. What do? Do you shoot the gun empty before you go home? For a long time, that was my practice until one day I went to the car and there were several pickup trucks parked next to me, and I pointed my muzzleloader in the ditch and fired it. The next thing I knew, 5 car alarms were sounding simultaneously. It's also possible to draw the charge using a ball worm. Here are 2 of them. It's basically a screw you put on the ramrod, you screw the thing into the lead bullet and pull it out. And if a bullet ever gets stuck in the middle of the barrel, that method is the first thing you will try in an attempt to remedy the problem. If you do draw the charge, the gun is now as dirty as it was had you fired it, and it's necessary to give it a normal cleaning after drawing the charge. Before we talk about a normal cleaning, we'll talk about what to do if the bullet is stuck in the middle of the barrel and you could not get it out with the ball worm all by itself. If excessive fouling, as we discussed, is what caused the bullet to get stuck in the middle of the barrel, your first challenge is to put hot soapy water in the barrel behind the bullet. This will do 2 things. It will soak the powder charge and make it utterly unignitable, and it will soften the fouling behind the bullet, allowing you to use the ramrod and push the bullet all the way down to the breech. The reason I say that is I think it's going to be much easier for you to screw the ball worm into the ball when the ball is all the way down to the breech. And once you get the ball worm in, I think you're going to find that the bullet will pull out with relative ease. The trick, of course, is getting the hot soapy water in the barrel behind the bullet. I've done this job myself, and the way I did it was remove the nipple, use a squeeze bottle with a little nozzle, fill that up with hot soapy water, and get some water down in the barrel, at least started by doing it that way. If you have the barrel full of hot soapy water and still the bullet doesn't want to move under the ramrod, what I've done is insert a wooden dowel down into the barrel and give the end of it a rap with a little mallet to get the bullet moving. This entire process, by the way, is extremely messy, and if you have to go through it once, I assure you, you will take special care to make sure you never get a bullet stuck in the middle of the barrel ever again. It's so messy, in fact, that when it happened to me, I had to remove the barrel, which is held down by a couple of pins, loosen all the screws, take the thing completely apart, dry everything, oil the inside of the lock, put some paste wax on the inside of the stock and some grease under the barrel before I put the whole thing back together. If, by comparison, the shooting session was uneventful, then cleaning is pretty uneventful too. Basically, what I do is I leave the nipple in, and I get some very hot soapy water down the bore with a small funnel. I use a jag and the cleaning rod to loosen up most of the fouling. I have a 45 caliber brush. I'll put that on the end of the cleaning rod, brush it a couple of times, and basically repeat the procedure until the water coming out of the nipple is not black and grungy. Then I switch to dry patches and use a number of those until they come out clean. And finally, when I'm completely done, I will pour very, very hot, clean, clear water down into the bore, shake it out, set the thing aside, and let it dry. The final rinse of very hot, clear water will heat the metal up, so much so that it will dry quite quickly by itself. A cleaning like this is nowhere near as messy as the one I described previously, and I don't ordinarily find it necessary to take the barrel out of the stock for a cleaning like this. Finally, when the gun is dry, I'll lubricate the inside of the barrel, take the nipple off, clean underneath that, put it back on, and the last part of the job is to give the outside of the barrel a light wipe with an oily cloth. One final detail is that this gun has a 32-inch barrel, and that's roughly 4 inches longer than average. I made a special cleaning rod out of a long piece of hickory I obtained to deal with this. You're probably going to find that most muzzleloaders have a barrel somewhere in the 28-inch vicinity, and if you have that, it's possible to perhaps use a shotgun cleaning rod to clean your gun. And some of the higher priced ramrods will have screw fittings on each end to allow you to use jags and worms just using the regular ramrod to clean the thing. And you might find the ramrod is actually made out of fiberglass. And all these things are functional options when it comes to coming up with a cleaning rod. So that's about it when it comes to the secrets and operation of this gun. Despite the fact that when I bought it, it was about one of the cheapest muzzleloaders you can get, I've always loved this thing dearly. It came in the form of a kit. You had to put it together, and I did in fact do that. After I'd been shooting it for a while, an older friend of mine who'd never fired a muzzleloader invited me out to his farm. I loaded the gun, explained everything that I was doing, put a cap on it, and invited him to shoot it. He said, "You shoot it." I said, "Okay, what do you want me to shoot at?" And he pointed to a fence post about 60 yards away. I cocked the gun, got a bead on the fence post, and pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the fence post, and a loose piece of wood did a somersault about 3 feet into the air. My friend yelled, "Damn, that thing can shoot!" Yes, it can.